The Galactic Education Consortium had, in its infinite wisdom and bureaucratic splendor, managed to reduce the entire complexity of interstellar civilization management into neat little categories. Like most academic institutions that had never actually set foot outside their ivory towers, or in this case their crystalline spires, they approached the messy business of real life with the kind of methodical precision that would make a filing cabinet weep with joy. Their curriculum on primitive species management was particularly thorough, complete with color-coded threat assessments, risk matrices, and enough flowcharts to wallpaper a small moon. The course catalog described it as an essential foundation for diplomatic and colonial administrators seeking to understand the delicate balance of emerging civilizations. What it actually taught was how to pat lesser species on the head while quietly ensuring they remained lesser. The classroom itself was a monument to academic pretension. Holographic displays showing rotating species classifications, comfortable bioadaptive seating that adjusted to accommodate the 17 different body types of advanced civilization, and that particular smell of recycled air and intellectual superiority that permeated educational facilities across the galaxy. Students from the hegemony's finest families attended these lectures, safe in the knowledge that they were learning how to properly manage the cosmic riffraff. Professor Yenth-Ka stood before his advanced xenobiology class with the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about anything important. His chitinous exterior gleamed under the artificial lighting, and his compound eyes swept over his students with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered this particular lecture approximately 437 times. Today, we examine perhaps the most fascinating case study in evolutionary dead ends, he announced, his mandibles clicking with what passed for academic enthusiasm among his species. The bipedal mammals of Sol 3, colloquially known as human. The holographic display shimmered to life, showing a rotating three-dimensional model of a standard human specimen. The students leaned forward with the kind of morbid curiosity typically reserved for traffic accidents or political scandal. Observe the complete absence of natural weapons. The professor continued, manipulating the hologram to highlight various anatomical features. No claws worth mentioning. No fangs. No natural armor plating. Their bite force registers at a pathetic 62 pounds per square inch. A house cat from Regal 4 could exert more pressure. Their night vision is so poor, they require artificial illumination to function in low light conditions. And their reaction speed, he paused dramatically. Well, let's just say they would lose a foot race to most sedentary plant life. A ripple of what passed for laughter among the diverse student body filled the room. A young Vorthan in the third row raised one of her 6 arms. Professor, if they're so obviously defective, how did they achieve space travel before natural selection corrected the oversight? An excellent question, Yenth-Ka replied, his antennae twitching with approval. The prevailing theory suggests they compensated for their physical inadequacies through tool use and primitive cunning. Think of them as the galactic equivalent of those small scavenger creatures that follow larger predators, surviving on scraps and staying out of the way of anything dangerous. The hologram shifted to show various human technologies. Their spacecraft looked cobbled together compared to the elegant bioships of advanced civilizations. Their weapons crude and inefficient. Their cities sprawling and chaotic rather than the ordered perfection of proper urban planning. Note the inefficient design philosophy, the professor continued. Where we achieve elegance through biological superiority and centuries of refinement, they compensate with brute force engineering and redundant systems. It's rather like watching someone try to perform surgery with a mining laser, technically functional, but embarrassingly crude. The students dutifully recorded this observation, their various note-taking appendages busy documenting humanity's obvious inferiority for future reference. Their social structure is equally primitive, Yenth-Ka continued, warming to his favorite topic. Tribal warfare persisted well into their space age. They maintain hundreds of separate governmental systems despite occupying a single planet, and their decision-making process relies heavily on something they call democracy, essentially allowing the least qualified individuals to make important choices through popular vote. A crystalline student near the back chimed with harmonics that translated roughly to mild confusion. If they're so clearly unsuitable for galactic citizenship, why haven't we simply relocated them to a more appropriate environment? The standard procedure for species showing signs of civilizational breakdown is containment and managed decline. The professor's compound eyes refocused on the questioning student. Policy considerations beyond the scope of this course, I'm afraid. The diplomatic corps has classified them as a protected developing species, requiring careful observation and minimal interference. Something about avoiding the appearance of colonial aggression, though I suspect it's more about not wanting to deal with the paperwork involved in formal extinction protocols. The class shared another moment of collective amusement at this bureaucratic wisdom. After all, why rush to solve a problem when you could simply file it under someone else's jurisdiction? Now then, Yenth-Ka said, returning to his lesson plan, let's examine some specific examples of human fragility in action. I've prepared a series of historical images from their archives that perfectly illustrate why this species requires our continued protection from the harsh realities of galactic civilization. He gestured toward the holographic display, which began cycling through various scenes of human activity. Each of these demonstrates the fundamental weakness that necessitates our guidance, and the professor's voice trailed off as an unexpected image materialized in the display. This wasn't from his carefully curated collection of human inadequacy. This appeared to be some sort of archival photograph, tagged with security clearances he didn't recognize. A student in the front row leaned forward. "Professor, what exactly are we looking at?" The holographic display flickered with the kind of technical hiccup that made professors everywhere develop stress-related molting patterns. What materialized before the class was decidedly not part of Professor Yenth-Ka's carefully prepared slideshow of human incompetence. Instead, they found themselves staring at what appeared to be a historical photograph, rendered in that peculiar flat image format that primitive species seemed to favor before discovering proper three-dimensional recording technology. The image showed a small human female, her age difficult to determine by alien standards but clearly in the juvenile stage of development. She stood amid what could only be described as the aftermath of some catastrophic event. Twisted metal structures jutted from cracked ground, debris scattered in patterns that suggested either explosion or impact, and a fine layer of particulate matter coated everything visible in the frame. The lighting was harsh and uneven, casting shadows that spoke of emergency illumination rather than natural sources. But it was the child herself that drew the eye and held it with uncomfortable persistence. Her clothing was torn and stained with substances that could have been anything from industrial lubricants to biological fluids. Dust and grime covered her from head to foot, yet she stood with a posture that suggested defiance rather than defeat. In her arms she clutched something, a bundle of fabric, or perhaps makeshift bedding, with the protective intensity typically associated with maternal behavior in species that actually possessed proper parenting instinct. "Fascinating," Professor Yenth-Ka muttered, his mandibles clicking as he tried to process what he was seeing. "This appears to be some sort of disaster documentation. Note the obvious signs of infrastructure failure and the complete absence of adult supervision. Clearly this demonstrates the species' tendency toward inadequate safety protocols." "And Professor," interrupted a hegemony student, whose crystalline structure resonated with curiosity, "why does the child appear to be functional?" It was an astute observation that made several other students shift uncomfortably in their bioadaptive seating. According to everything they had learned about human physiology, a juvenile of the species should have been completely helpless in such circumstances. Their young required constant care and protection for an absurdly extended period compared to properly evolved species. Yet this particular specimen showed no signs of the panic, confusion, or biological shutdown that should have been inevitable. "Environmental adaptation is limited in primitive species," Yenth-Ka explained, though his voice carried less certainty than usual. "They likely develop rudimentary survival responses when the display suddenly expanded, showing additional data that had been embedded with the image. Metadata scrolled past in streams of information that made the professor's antennae twitch with growing unease. File classifications, archive references, historical markers, and most troubling of all, a timestamp that placed this image during a period that the Galactic Historical Database had marked as unsurvivable conditions. "Oh," said Professor Yenth-Ka in the tone of someone who had just realized they might have made a tiny miscalculation. Perhaps several tiny miscalculations, possibly a cascade of tiny miscalculations, that were about to become one very large problem. A Vorthan student raised multiple appendages simultaneously. "Professor, what exactly constitutes unsurvivable conditions in the context of human environmental tolerance?" The question hung in the air like a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Professor Yenth-Ka found himself accessing the historical database with the kind of reluctant determination typically reserved for checking one's medical test results or reviewing tax assessments. The Great Solar Flare Crisis of 2157, he read aloud, his voice taking on the mechanical quality that academics adopted when reality began contradicting their carefully constructed theories. A Class X solar event resulted in complete communications blackout across 3 human colonial systems. Electromagnetic pulse damage rendered all major technological systems inoperable. Radiation levels exceeded safe exposure limits for most known organic life forms by factors of 12 to 15. Estimated casualty projections approached total population loss. The classroom fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the increasingly rapid clicking of the professor's mandibles, a sure sign of academic distress among his species. The projected mortality rate, he continued, because sometimes the only way out of an intellectual crisis was straight through it, was 99.7% within the first 72 hours. Complete ecosystem collapse was anticipated within 1 standard week. A student near the back made a sound that could have been either a question or a small existential crisis. Professor, if those were the conditions, then this photograph should be showing us a course. Professor Yenth-Ka stared at the image with the growing realization that his understanding of human limitations might have contained a few minor gaps, the kind of gaps that swallow entire academic careers and leave behind only the faint smell of burning credentials. The child in the photograph continued to stare back at them with eyes that held something the professor was beginning to suspect he had fundamentally misunderstood. It wasn't fear, wasn't helplessness, wasn't the glazed confusion of a primitive mind, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond its comprehension. It was determination, raw, stubborn, utterly unreasonable determination. Perhaps, Professor Yenth-Ka said carefully, we should examine the full historical context of this image before drawing any conclusion. Because sometimes when you're standing at the edge of discovering that everything you thought you knew about a species was catastrophically wrong, the only sensible response is to jump off that cliff with both feet and hope there's something other than sharp rocks at the bottom. Professor Yenth-Ka accessed the full historical archive with the kind of methodical precision that academics used when they suspected they were about to discover something that would require burning their previous research and starting over from scratch. The holographic display expanded to show a comprehensive timeline of the Great Solar Flare Crisis, complete with radiation readings, casualty reports, and environmental data that painted a picture of cosmic-scale devastation. What emerged was the kind of story that made even the most hardened xenobiologists question their career choices. The colony on Kepler 422c had been one of humanity's more ambitious settlements, a mining operation supporting nearly 300 individuals in what the humans optimistically called challenging environmental conditions, and what any reasonable species would have labeled a death trap with air recycling. When the solar flare hit, it didn't just knock out their communications and power system. It turned their supposedly safe underground facility into what amounted to a radiation-flooded tomb with a 20-day air supply and no functioning life support. The first wave of casualties came within hours as the older colonists succumbed to radiation poisoning. The second wave followed as the environmental systems failed, and carbon dioxide levels began climbing toward lethal concentration. By day 3, according to the automated emergency beacons that had managed to survive the electromagnetic pulse, the colony should have been nothing but a very expensive mausoleum. This is where the historical record becomes unusual, Professor Yenth-Ka announced, his compound eyes scanning the data with the kind of fascination typically reserved for observing train wrecks or political campaigns. At precisely 72 hours post-event, long-range sensors detected what appeared to be coordinated activity within the facility. The class leaned forward with collective interest. Coordinated activity usually implied the presence of functioning adults with technical expertise and proper emergency training. It did not typically imply a 12-year-old human child who should have been among the first casualties. The individual in the photograph, the professor continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone reading their own obituary, had apparently taken command of the survival effort when the adult population became incapacitated. A crystalline student resonated with what translated roughly to polite skepticism. Professor, Surely you mean she was following adult instructions. Human juveniles lack the cognitive development for independent problem-solving in crisis situations. Professor Yenth-Ka wished that were true. He really genuinely, desperately wished that were true. Unfortunately, the historical record had other ideas about the cognitive limitations of human juveniles under pressure. The child, because sometimes facts needed to be stated even when they violated every principle of evolutionary common sense, improvised a functional water reclamation system, using components salvaged from mining equipment, jury-rigged radiation shielding from cargo containers, and established a sustainable air filtration system, using materials that, according to our engineering consultants, should not have been capable of supporting life under those conditions. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that occurred when an entire classroom simultaneously realized that everything they thought they knew about a subject was not just wrong, but spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Furthermore, the professor continued, because apparently the universe had decided that his academic reputation needed to be not just damaged, but completely obliterated. She maintained 47 individuals in stable condition for 18 days using nothing but improvised medical techniques, scavenged supplies, and what the rescue teams later described as terrifyingly competent field medicine for someone who shouldn't have known which end of a bandage to use. A Vorthan student raised several appendages in what appeared to be either a question or a surrender gesture. Professor, what was the Galactic response to this situation? This was where the story moved from merely improbable into the realm of cosmic embarrassment. Professor Yenth-Ka accessed the rescue operation files with the enthusiasm of someone opening their tax audit result. 12 separate alien rescue missions were dispatched to the colony, he announced. The first 3 turned back when their sensors confirmed radiation levels that would have been lethal to their species within minutes. The next 4 aborted their approach when their environmental suits registered atmospheric conditions incompatible with their life support systems. The remaining 5 made it to the facility but were unable to operate effectively in the contaminated environment. The implications of this information settled over the classroom like a particularly uncomfortable blanket. While the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had concluded that the situation was unsurvivable and retreated to safe distances, a human child had not only survived, but had kept nearly 50 others alive using what amounted to cosmic-scale jury-rigging. The final Professor Yenth-Ka continued, his mandibles now clicking in patterns that suggested advanced academic distress, was performed by human vessels whose crews described the radiation levels as annoying, and the environmental conditions as slightly less comfortable than a typical mining operation. But the truly disturbing part wasn't the rescue itself. It was what the rescue teams found when they finally reached the survivors. The child had not simply kept people alive. She had organized them into work details, established a functional command structure, implemented rationing systems that maximized their resource efficiency, and created what the official report described as a surprisingly effective small-scale civilization operating under conditions that should have precluded conscious thought, much less complex planning. The rescue team, Professor Yenth-Ka, read from the official documentation, his voice growing fainter with each word, reported that the survivors were not only in stable condition, but were actively engaged in infrastructure improvement projects, designed to make their situation more sustainable for extended periods. A student near the back made a sound that could have been either a question or the beginning of a nervous breakdown. Professor, are you telling us that this human child created a functioning society inside a radioactive tomb, using mining scraps and sheer bloody-mindedness? Professor Yenth-Ka stared at the historical data, then at the photograph of the small human female with her determined expression and protective posture, then back at the data that insisted this was not some elaborate academic hoax, but documented historical fact. Yes, he said finally, that appears to be exactly what I'm telling you. The professor found himself accessing additional human survival records with the kind of morbid curiosity that made people slow down to look at accident scenes. What he discovered was a pattern so consistent and so fundamentally disturbing that it challenged every assumption about species classification that the Galactic Education Consortium had spent centuries developing. Humans surviving in hard vacuum with compromised spacesuits for periods that should have resulted in immediate death. Humans walking away from spacecraft crashes that had reduced their vessels to component atoms. Humans recovering from diseases that had killed hardier species with superior immune systems. Humans adapting to environmental conditions that exceeded the tolerance ranges of species specifically evolved for extreme environments. The classification protocols, Professor Yenth-Ka muttered, more to himself than to his students, may require some revision. What followed could only be described as an academic avalanche of the most catastrophic proportion. Professor Yenth-Ka, driven by the kind of intellectual masochism that compelled researchers to keep pulling threads even when they suspected the entire fabric of their understanding was about to unravel, began accessing additional human survival records. What he discovered was not a series of isolated incidents, but a pattern so consistent and so fundamentally terrifying that it suggested the galaxy had been operating under a massive taxonomical error for the better part of 3 centuries. The holographic display began cycling through case after case of what could only be termed impossible human survival events, each one more ludicrous than the last, each one documented with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that made denial impossible and sleep optional. There was the incident on Europa Station, where a human engineer named Henderson had survived 17 days in hard vacuum after his EVA suit suffered catastrophic decompression. The medical report noted that he had somehow managed to create a makeshift pressure seal using industrial adhesive and sheer bloody-mindedness, then continued his repair work while breathing through what amounted to a technical impossibility. The attending hegemony physician had required 3 months of psychological counseling after examining a patient who, by all known medical science, should have been a frozen corpse. The display shifted to show the wreckage of the transport vessel, Endeavour, which had crashed into the methane seas of Titan, with enough force to create what the physics report described as a crater that violated several fundamental laws regarding kinetic energy distribution. The crash should have been instantly fatal to all occupants. Instead, the human passengers had not only survived but had somehow converted the wreckage into a functional habitat, complete with atmospheric processing and hydroponic food production. The rescue team had arrived expecting to recover bodies and instead found a thriving community that had already established trade relations with the local mining operation. "This is beginning to resemble a pattern," observed a crystalline student, whose harmonic frequencies suggested the early stages of existential crisis. "Are we certain these records haven't been corrupted by some form of systematic data error?" Professor Yenth-Ka wished they had been. A nice simple database corruption would have been so much easier to explain to his department head than the growing realization that the Galactic Education Consortium had been spectacularly wrong about humanity for longer than most civilizations had possessed written language. The display continued its relentless parade of human impossibilities. There was the mining colony on Proxima B, where the entire population had survived a plague that had killed 90% of the more resilient Vorthan species. Not only had they survived, they had somehow developed an immunity that they then shared with other affected colonies, through what the medical reports described as aggressively unorthodox vaccine distribution method. Then came the records from the Kepler incident, where a human cargo hauler had been caught in a gravitational anomaly that should have compressed any known organic matter into component particles. Instead of dying in the theoretically appropriate manner, the crew had somehow modified their vessel's structural integrity field to create what the engineering analysis called a pocket of stable space-time that shouldn't exist according to any known physics principle. They had then used this impossible bubble of reality to rescue 17 other vessels that had been caught in the same anomaly. "Professor," ventured a hegemony student, whose bioluminescent patterns indicated advanced academic distress, "are we to understand that humans routinely survive situations that would kill species with superior physical capability?" "It appears," Professor Yenth-Ka replied, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose life's work had just been revealed as elaborate fiction, "that they don't just survive such situations. They seem to actively seek them out and then complain when the level of danger isn't stimulating enough." The database yielded more examples with the inexorable persistence of a particularly sadistic examination. Humans surviving exposure to vacuum by breathing out and letting their saliva boil, while maintaining consciousness long enough to reach safety. Humans walking away from explosions that had vaporized everything else within a 3-kilometer radius. Humans recovering from injuries that would have required complete body replacement for any reasonable species. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the psychological profile that emerged from these survival accounts. These weren't desperate creatures clinging to life through lucky accident. These were individuals who seemed to regard lethal danger as a minor inconvenience and impossible odds as a personal challenge. The medical reports were particularly enlightening. Where other species experienced system shock and cognitive shutdown when faced with life-threatening situations, humans appeared to enter what their own physicians described as crisis optimization mode. Their brains didn't shut down under extreme stress. They somehow became more efficient. Their bodies didn't fail when pushed beyond normal limits. They adapted and found new limits to exceed. "There's something else," Professor Yenth-Ka announced, his mandibles clicking in patterns that suggested his worldview was undergoing complete structural collapse. The psychological aberrations of these survivors show a consistent pattern. They don't consider their actions extraordinary. They seem genuinely surprised when other species react with shock to their survival accounts. A Vorthan student made a sound that could have been laughter or weeping. "You're saying they don't even realize they're violating the laws of biology?" According to their own cultural records, the professor continued, accessing humanity's entertainment databases with the kind of morbid fascination that made people read their own medical charts. They create fictional narratives for entertainment purposes that involve surviving even more impossible situations. Their children play games that simulate surviving scenarios that would traumatize adult members of most civilized species. The holographic display showed examples of human recreational activities, extreme sports that involved throwing themselves off cliffs with minimal safety equipment, underwater exploration in environments that would crush most species' exoskeleton, and something called adventure tourism, that involved paying money to be placed in situations that any reasonable insurance company would classify as deliberate suicide attempts. Their military training exercises, Professor Yenth-Ka read from official human documents, his voice growing faint with disbelief, routinely involve conditions that exceed the survival parameters of actual combat situations faced by other species' elite forces. The classroom had fallen into the kind of profound silence that occurs when an entire generation of students simultaneously says that their education has been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about the nature of reality. "Professor," asked a student whose biosignatures indicated the early stages of academic shock, "what does this mean for our current classification of humanity as a protected developing species?" Professor Yenth-Ka stared at the photograph that had started this intellectual catastrophe. The small human female continued to gaze back at him with those eyes that held something he now recognized as the most terrifying force in the known galaxy. Human determination combined with human resourcefulness, and an apparent complete disregard for the concept of impossible. "I believe," he said slowly, accessing the official species classification database with the careful precision of someone defusing an academic bomb, "we may need to update our threat assessment protocol." The database showed humanity's current classification: fragile species requiring protection and careful guidance. Professor Yenth-Ka stared at those words, then at the mounting evidence that suggested humanity was about as fragile as a neutron star, and roughly as predictable as a quantum mechanics experiment conducted by caffeinated graduate students. With the kind of bureaucratic precision that had taken him 40 years to master, he began typing the new classification: species of extreme concern, recommend immediate diplomatic engagement and under no circumstances should be considered hostile. He paused, then added, "Note, previous classification as fragile may have been based on incomplete data and wishful thinking." The photograph of the unnamed human child was filed in the historical archives under a new category, turning points that should have been obvious in retrospect. Next to it, Professor Yenth-Ka added his own addendum: "The day we learned that the most dangerous phrase in any language is 'hold my beer, I've got an idea.' Because sometimes when you discover that everything you thought you knew about a species was not just wrong but catastrophically backwards, the only appropriate response is to update your files and hope they never find out how badly you underestimated them." The galaxy, Professor Yenth-Ka reflected, was about to become a much more interesting place.